It's Reality Check with Craig Price.
I'm an idiot.
4 minutes in and I'm already wrong.
I'm like a monkey. Hello, look at me. Craig, shut up.
Hey, I need you guys to do these things.
You're like a beautiful mind. I'm more like Forrest Gump. So it's Reality Check with Craig Price. I am Craig Price. This week, Marnie Green stops in to talk about Painless Performance Conversations. Welcome back to the podcast. If you're a first-time listener, welcome to the podcast. I'm suffering a little bit from an allergy attack, so I'm kind of loopy on drugs, and I'll make this as brief as possible because nobody likes to talk to an employee about performance issues. It's awkward. You don't want to be the bad guy. You don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. You don't know what to say or how to say it without being a jerk. It's uncomfortable. So our guest today has written a book on how to have those conversations without all that guilt and icky feelings for doing what you're supposed to, but yet making people feel bad. It's what you do. Actually, Marnie can explain this better than I can. She's more lucid. I'm on drugs. I'm going to go take some pills while you listen to Marnie Green.
Many managers try to avoid performance-based conversations with their employees because they're afraid of conflict. I mean, they don't, or they just don't want to look like a bad guy, or they don't want to be thought of as, they want to be their buddy. They want to be the employee's buddy. So they kind of push it off and delay. So when you see in a performance issue, how quickly should you address it?
As soon as possible. And I'm with you, Craig, that managers oftentimes I really fear they see performance conversations as something that's painful. And I think part of that is because they don't really have the skills or they don't have the tools that they need to be able to address the conversation right when they see it. And they chew on it and they mull over it and they procrastinate, hoping that the issue is going to go away. And so I think the more prepared they are and the more tools that they have, the more likely they are to get over that procrastination or that fear of initiating a conversation.
Yeah, I think they're hoping that it just fixes itself. And do you allow any time for any kind of self-correction, or is it just jump in there, tell them what the issue is, and then follow up later?
I hate to answer with the typical answer here, but it depends.
Sure.
I think it depends on what the issue is with the employee, how it's impacting the organization, how it's impacting customers or the rest of the team. And in some cases, issues need to be addressed right now. And others, if it's super minor, they were late one time in a year, probably not, and it didn't have a major impact on anybody. So you might just want to not say anything and then see if the behavior continues. But the ultimate question, though, is how does this impact the work environment? And if it's not impacting the work environment, then you really have to ask yourself, is it worth a conversation?
And my guest today is Marnie Green. She's got a brand new book out called Painless Performance Conversations, a practical approach to critical day-to-day workplace discussions. Since a lot of people will try to avoid all these things that we were just talking about, how can you get yourself in the right headspace before you start talking to your performance problem?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's half of what the new book is about. I call them mindsets, and I think there's some perspectives or mindsets that managers have to have in mind before they even open their mouths and start the conversation. So the first is they've got to isolate what the behavior is. Because if you go to an employee and you say, I need you to have a better attitude, or I need you to shape up, I need you to be a better team player, I need you to show a little more urgency, the employee doesn't really know what you want them to do differently. So you've got to first isolate what is the behavior that's not meeting the expectation so that you can be very specific and tangible about what change is expected. The second mindset, go ahead.
No, I was going to say attitude can change from moment to moment because that's a variable. I mean, you tell them, cheer up, and they get a phone call that one of their parents has died, their attitude changes drastically. Or just the fact that you talk to them in a certain way at a certain time can change their attitude. So behavior is something that's underlying, you're saying. It's kind of a baseline.
Well, I think the behavior is what manifests when somebody based on your attitude. So if you have a positive attitude or you have an enthusiastic attitude about your job, your behaviors will show that. You'll smile, you'll work a little bit faster, you'll speak up and make suggestions for changes. If you've got an attitude that is not so positive, it's probably going to show up in your behaviors as well. in terms of how quickly you are resolving issues or quick to resolve customer concerns or even just to help a teammate. So it's the physical behavior that we can observe that's easier to help an employee understand than it would be the attitude. The attitude's not tangible.
Right. So you want to get the right behavior, and then you address the behavior, and then what other? You said you had 3 others.
Yeah. So the next one then is to eliminate the judgment. I think a lot of managers go into conversations, and I coach with these managers all the time, where they enter the conversation already having made up their mind about what the employee thinks, what the employee, why the employee behaved the way they did, and how they think the employee should solve the problem. In fact, the manager would just as soon solve the problem for the employee. And then we wonder why the employees get defensive and don't really want to be on the same team. So the second mindset is to eliminate the judgment and just focus on the facts or the evidence that you observe. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that a lot of times that they already have gone through the entire conversation in their heads of what's going to happen. Like, I'm going to say this, they're going to say that, and then I'm going to counter with this, and then they're going to say something stupid, and I'm going to come up with this great point, and that's going to shut everything up and fix it.
Exactly. And then they wonder why employees are not bought into, the workplace or why they're not enthusiastic about the solutions that are being proposed. So it's really about engaging the employee and create the first 2 mindsets that are about creating an environment where the employee feels like they can play an equal role, where they actually have space in the conversation. That's actually the third mindset has to do with inquiry, and the mindset is to inquire with purpose. So I always like to help managers think your job is not to solve the issues for the employees. It's not even to come up with the solutions. Your job is to frame what the issue is and be clear about your expectations, and then help the employee get to come to their own conclusions about what needs to change. Then you have the buy-in. And so the questioning skills are critical, and the mindset has to be that I'm curious about how this employee sees this issue, rather than coming in with a solution in mind already.
So how do you start a conversation, which is basically, even if you boil it down in their mind, it's going to be a criticism, even though it's a constructive criticism or a valuable comment. How do you start that conversation without sparking off their defensiveness? Right.
It's about sticking to those facts, to the behaviors, and comparing that to the expectation. So it might be something like, Craig, I noticed that today during the staff meeting, you didn't speak up and you were on your phone the entire time. You seemed, you were disengaged. And we value teamwork around here, and I'm wondering what's going on. And then wait for the employee to give you their perspective. Well, I was actually doing other things I was prioritizing. Really, I'm surprised because there were some times during the meeting where I know that you had input that you could have shared, and you didn't even look up and engage with your coworkers, and the coworkers really value what you have to say. So I'm just curious, what was going on in your mind during the meeting? And then the conversation would go on from there. Now, you may have an employee who doesn't want to play, and eventually you just say, well, here's my expectation, and I really hope you'll speak up the next time. But oftentimes the employees then, if you give them enough space in the conversation, they're going to disclose something that you can then build upon. Well, and how can you relay expectations without coming across as an idiot? Because sometimes expectations, you need to lay the groundwork down, but if you give them too much detail, it can come down as condescending scolding, like I need you to do this in this way because, and then all of a sudden you sound like a moron, or you give them vague instructions that they can't possibly correct. So how can you set expectations properly without getting yourself into that condescending too much or vague not enough? Right. And I think it's usually one or the other. So it starts very early in the relationship between the supervisor and the employee. So I actually have 2 chapters in the book that are devoted to establishing your expectations and conveying your expectations. And I've got a whole bunch of tools in there about creating a clear picture about what you as a supervisor represent. So I think it's really unfair to never share what you expect and then come down on an employee because they haven't met your expectations. That's just a gotcha, and you're not going to create a productive work environment where people feel like they're always on guard. We'll share a couple of those tools. Well, I'll tell you, one of them actually came from an experience that I had early in my career where I was a brand new employee, and my manager sat me down within the first 5-10 minutes of the job and had a list of expectations. I mean, he had it written down. And they were very, very simple things. They had to do with what really, it wasn't an all-encompassing list. It wasn't policies. It wasn't even measurable goals. It was just like the 5 things that he thought were important for professionalism and success in the office. In fact, that's how he started the conversation. He started the conversation like this. Marnie, my job here as your manager is to help you be wildly successful. And for you to be wildly successful, you got to understand my expectations. And I've worked here long enough to understand that there's a couple things that will really make a difference. And then that's what he had on the list. There are things like making sure that you're on time for everything, and being accountable and using the in and out board so he could find me, helping out coworkers and being customer focused. But it was really a strong message right up front. And it's funny, he never had to talk about any of those issues with anybody on the team because he always made them clear right up front.
So how can you deal with some of these issues that can be a little more awkward? Because obviously expectations of the workplace, you need to be professional, you need to be on time. There are some that are, no matter where you work, no matter where you go, they're going to be pretty standard and pretty default kind of situations. But how can you deal with, you've got a guy in a cubicle three spots over who may not bathe on a regular basis, or you've got someone who drops F-bombs in front of customers when they shouldn't. And it's not like he's being attacked. He just kind of says it in a casual way like people do.
Doesn't
sometimes.
even realize it,
Yeah. How can you address some of those more personal but yet necessary conversations? Because that's where it starts getting painful.
Yeah, and that's where the framework that I use is, number one, you got to be clear about what the behavior is that that you're getting that isn't appropriate or whatever. So let's just say drop an F-bomb with customers, not appropriate. But then you got to be able to frame that into what would you rather see. So you'd rather see conversations where the customers feels like they're respected and where the customers aren't complaining about it. But then the real hook is, how does that impact the work environment? Because if you say, I don't want you to drop any F-bombs in the course of your work with me because I don't like it, that's kind of hard to convince. But if I can say to you, Craig, when you drop an F-bomb, it makes the customer, I have customers then call and complain about it. And when customers call and complain about it, it means I can't send you their work anymore, or we lose customers. So there's got to be some impact, or that it's hard to justify that you should even that your request for a change is valid.
Yeah, well, the F-bomb one's pretty cut and dry. You're not supposed to say that in general. But we'll say the guy in the cubicle three spots over who, may have an issue with hygiene, or will have inappropriate conversations that aren't necessarily HR restricted, but it's just kind of weird.
Distracting. The fact that it even brings up that anybody in the workforce, because you know about it because somebody's either complained or you've noticed it and it's distracting, or it takes our focus away from what our overall mission is, or our objectives. So there's still an impact. I've never run across anything that people think of as an issue in the workplace, if it's a legitimate issue that needs a conversation, that doesn't have some impact, either on the individual and their own credibility, or on the team's ability, or on individuals on the team, or on customers. So the guy who has poor hygiene, who stinks, it's impacting his other people's perceptions of him. And so I would have the conversation about that this is impacting how others perceive him, which then affects his ability to be effective with his teammates or with his customers. If he's not seen as credible, or he's not seen as professional, then he's not going to be successful.
Well, and I've in the past either was a fantastic manager or the world's worst manager, because I would either do something, I try to do things a little proactively, instead of waiting for a complaint, being aware of what was going on and addressing it that way. But I would only go to the legitimate ones. How do you, and I also you have to know your people, but how do you deal with someone who reacts badly to your, I go to that guy and say, look, this is a distraction that's causing a problem, and then he goes off. How can...
and I think there's the key right there. If you go to him with a conclusion that this is a problem and it's distracting, but you don't have any evidence to support that, you just kind of are being proactive, which is great, good for you. But if there's nothing to back that up, evidence, then he's going to say, what do you mean? Prove it to me. But if I can say, I've had 2 people in the office come to me in the last 3 days and said that there's a distinct odor coming from your cubicle, and it's really caused them to think twice, then this is a concern to me. And I think the other thing we have to do is agree that we could explore that, but the key to it is to get the other person to agree that they want to be seen as credible, or that they want to be seen as professional, or that they want to be successful. So it may not be, I don't need them to agree that they stink or not. That's not the issue.
Yeah.
But the issue is, you want to be seen as a professional, right, Craig? I know, or can we agree that your credibility is essential to your success as a salesperson here? And if the person, all I need to do is get a yes to something, now we have a common ground that we can build upon. But if I'm debating the facts, whether he stinks or he doesn't, or whether whatever, or I think it might be a problem for me in the future, or it's not, but I don't have any legitimate, concrete something to go on, like a couple complaints, then it's a little harder to go with.
Now, and you've done a lot of research on this, and you've got a lot of great examples in the book. What are 1 or 2 of the most common painful conversations that people have, and how can we navigate those in particular?
That's a really good question. Yeah, in the back of the book, I've got just a whole bunch of what ifs, because the book presents models and ideas and some tools, but I hear some of the same what ifs over and over again. I think one is, what if the employee really doesn't see that there's a problem? And, convincing them there's a problem, which is almost it's a impossible task to try to convince somebody else of something unless you have that tangible data. I think the other thing that I hear a lot of is, what if I have a conflict between 2 employees? They're both right or they're both wrong, but regardless, I'm the one in the middle, and I've got to get them to talk. And so the principles in the book really help just to start that conversation. It's not about, I'm not addressing, I could write a whole other book on mediation between employees, but the principles still apply just to start the conversation, just to get started, which is where we usually have the biggest problem, just getting started.
Yeah, and it's difficult because you don't want people to get offended. If you're going to be evidence-based, you want to try to, how much do you gather before they're convinced? Because, like you said, sometimes the hardest thing is just convincing them there's an issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think part of it is that to let go of that. Your job isn't to convince them to agree with you that there's an issue, but the key is to get them to agree about how you want to be going forward. So a lot of the principles that I use have to do with being future-focused, because what happened in the past and whether they messed up in the past is done. But can we agree that in the future, we want no customer complaints, we want a solid team, we want you to be seen as credible, whatever it is that you agree to. And then once you have that, then the employee says, oh, well, this guy's on my side. Maybe I will talk about some alternative ways to approach this.
So for you, is it a lot of not necessarily evidence collecting? Because like I said, I was trying to be, when I did things, I tried to be more proactive because I saw hints of problems before they exploded. I didn't want to wait until a customer said something, because then it's already too late, because that's already affected that customer. And I'm trying to eliminate those situations ahead of time without just randomly making up stuff and walking up to them and go, well, if you ever think about doing this, don't. Because that's just a waste of time. Going up with possible scenarios that you could offend customers with is just exercise in futility, because customers can also be crazy, just like employees. And anything they could do everything right, and a customer could still get offended.
Exactly. But it does that, because of that. That's why you've got to start with the expectations. That's why I think it's so important to be upfront and say, this is how I, as a leader, want us to be seen. There's some vision in here. I want our work group to be seen as the highest performing in the company, or I want our company to be seen as the number one choice among our customers. Something that defines where we're shooting towards, that's compelling, and that employees get excited about. In the book, there's a little section on that called the stump speech. And the idea that before you can start having conversations about what's right and what's wrong, or how you need people to change, you got to be clear about what that looks like to start with. And then you reinforce that like a politician would almost. This is what we're about. This is what we're about. So then when you see examples where an employee isn't supporting it or could potentially not be going in a direction that wouldn't support your mission, it's just par for the course that you have the conversation. So it's just, you're doing it all the time.
Do you have a system in place where every X amount of days or X amount of weeks, or do you repeat your stump speech? Because that's why it's a stump speech, because they do it over and over and over again to get a consistent message across the country. Is there is there a system in place where you can, I guess, follow up with the expectations and see if people are actually measuring up and doing those without sound like you're nagging or, some kind of, you're pestering all the time about this? Is there a system you have?
No, I think for me, it's just a matter of looking for opportunities to use whatever that is. So I'll give you an example. I'm working with a team right now where they've got dual offices, dual roles, one in an office in Illinois and one in Arizona, and they have, everybody in Arizona has a like colleague in Illinois. Okay, so they've got two identical functions, but they operate differently. And the ultimate goal for the team is that they're synonymous, that all their processes, all their answers, everything they do for their customers is identical, but right now they're not. So they've got a kind of a concept, I guess, that the managers are really pushing, that they call the team of 30. It's not 15 in one and 15 in another, it's the team of 30. And so every time they talk about their process, their functions, their, all their rules and their steps and exactly their customer experience, they talk about it from the perspective of the team of 30. You're part of the whole thing, not just your geographic location. So to me, that's part of the stump speech. Every time they get a chance, they use that term. And even with me in the call I had with them the other day, I bet they said that 20 times. It's just what the managers that's their vision.
Now, have you found that different generations accept different information? Because I say this because, a lot of young workers are not used to any type of criticisms, let's say, even though it's not criticism, it's critiquing of their performance. They're used to being told how great they are constantly, regardless of how great they are. So when you broach the subject of, hey, you're doing this not necessarily the best way we want, or you're doing this incorrectly, we would love you to do it this way, they can get a little offended. But also you have people who love to be taken by the hand and spoon-fed the entire way.
I think it goes back to that, what I keep hearing in my mind, what that first manager that I had said to me. My job here is to help you be wildly successful. So if the employee knows that your motivation for bringing up giving any kind of performance feedback is to help rather than to punish in any way, I think then you create an environment, it's a culture where people are open to feedback. So if I do it every day, and I do with my staff, every day, let's talk about how could we have done this better, how are you going to do it differently next time, it changes the nature of the conversation. So when you do have to talk about something that didn't go well or somebody who really isn't meeting expectations, it's just another conversation that you're having.
Now, do you try to have little tiny conversations with everybody whenever you can, or do you have team meetings?
Absolutely. All the time. I mean, for me and my staff, we are all remote. So a lot of it is we do through email. But if I see anything where I've got to maybe do a little tweak or a little correction, I pick up the phone immediately. And we have regular meetings, face-to-face meetings every week or two. And so I make sure, and every one of those meetings, there's a conversation about, okay, so what have you done lately and what are you going to do differently next time to make it even better?
So it's basically you're opportunist. Whenever you see that opening to reinforce your expectations, you jump in and do it.
Continuous, because if you're not focusing on continuous improvement with your staff and with your work group, then you're always going to be behind the eight ball. You're always going to be reacting, which is what causes people to get defensive. But if you're always up front and say, hey, I can see, this is where I want to take it, and I can see one or two things that you might be able to do to help us get there, then they're on board.
Well, the book is Painless Performance Conversations, a practical approach to critical day-to-day workplace discussions, written by the lovely and talented Marnie Green. Marnie, if someone wants to hire you, either as a consultant or as a keynoter, to come in and talk to their company, their association, who should they talk to and where can they find you?
They can find me online at managementEducationGroup.com. I also have a Facebook page, and I'm on Twitter at Marnie Green.
Well, I hope this was a painless conversation.
Absolutely. Likewise.
I certainly appreciate the time, and will I see you at National this year?
Yes. Yes. In fact, if all goes well, I will be on the stage receiving my CSP medal.
Great. Well, congratulations in advance, and I look forward to seeing you in Philadelphia.
All right. Thanks, Craig.
In this moment of clarity, let me thank Marnie for coming on the show. You can find us on Twitter at RealityCheckPod, on the worldwide interwebs at realitycheckpodcast.com. If you have any questions, comments, or guest suggestions, you can email me, Craig, at speakercraigprice.com, as well as like us on Facebook or go to iTunes. Leave a review, 5-star rating. We'd love either one. No show next week as we honor Memorial Day. We'll talk to you soon. I'm on drugs.